have your attention? Can I have your attention? Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce to you guys our third and final keynote speaker. Angela Booker is an associate professor at UC San Diego. She received her PhD at Stanford, and she studies ways that youth, families, and schools make use of media and technology for participation, learning, and community development. She is particularly concerned with addressing barriers that diminish access to public participation among underrepresented and disenfranchised communities. She uses ethnographic, qualitative, and design-based research methods to examine typical and emerging practices where youth and adults work together, and at times in conflict. She collaborates with youth, community partners, educators, and scholars to do this work. So Angela shared with us some of the things that she is planning to talk with us about today, and if she even only talks to us about a quarter of those things, we are in for a huge treat. So it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Angela Booker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm tremendously nervous, like little kid nervous, so thanks for your patience with me. I used to wait tables, and they told us when you start, just tell the table that you're nervous, and they're more friendly, so I hope it works here. So today, I'm going to give a talk I haven't really given before. I'm going to think through, hopefully with you, some ideas that I've been trying to work with many wonderful colleagues, and so we'll see where we can get. I want to add that I want to keep in mind, my changes aren't here. I want to keep in mind that throughout this talk, I'm focusing on how marginalization, social stratification, and ableism persist relentlessly. And that's the place from which I'm beginning. And I'm just going to jump right in because I have a ton to go through. So I thought, thinking back to how I encountered ethical questions as a young scholar and as a young person, I would want to think a little bit about the early conversations in the 90s that I was encountering when email was first getting started and Netscape and those kinds of things were coming out, and I was working at the Elm prompt. And the conversations were often about the digital divide, and they were also about a kind of frontier, what was going, so a very kind of strong, palpable excitement about what was going to happen as people got online and the web emerged. As I continued to develop in that work and I completed my graduate degree, and I started to get invited to panels, people were asking a lot about young people's privacy. When things like free tools like Google's Gmail and things like that came out, people started thinking, well, what are young people able to think about when it comes to putting their data out there? And certainly with Dr. Noble's talk yesterday, it sort of helps us think about where that's gone. And then, of course, we've dropped right into those old technophobia, techno-utopia dialogues that have sort of continued and will continue as we continue to develop these ideas. In the world of scholarship, we've started to talk then through those years about different kinds of literacy and emerging ecologies for young people. And that helps us think about subjectivity and the kinds of things that develop, and also helps us anticipate the kinds of power relations that are going to come up. And that's a thing that's really central to what I care about. We also have had to grapple with developmental logics. Who's ready for what, when, and under what circumstances? And we've thought a lot about questions of voice. When are youth expressing what they think and what they feel? When are, we have a lot of undermining of young people by showing in some way that some other person co-opted them or had some other idea that they're just parroting, right? So we have these kind of critical issues of that come through questions of voice, and then of course many forms of epistemology, ways of knowing, and a sort of transition from thinking about young people as delinquents to thinking about young people as assets and bringing something forward. And as we move into conversations that I've had here at the conference, we have lots of conversations around accessibility now, transformation, change. So we hear a little bit less of the digital divide commentary, even though certainly that you could apply that logic, but we move more toward these questions of change. But I want to also offer another perspective on ethics with young people then and now. In my first research project, I was looking at students who were trying to influence policy in their school district. And a couple years ago, I went back and kind of tried to look at what was going on with that. And I found this from 1976, when I was 2 years old. I found this pamphlet of young people who were in the same program in 1976, and this was the agenda they had for their forum. So I just want to kind of point this out to you here. And then I jumped ahead to when I was doing my research in 2003, and then again I jumped ahead to what the students were doing in 2015. And these were their agendas. And the things I want to point out to you here are things like bathrooms are still on the list of problems that they're grappling with. They still want a vote on the school board, and they don't have it. They were dealing with integration questions in 1976, and they're dealing with desegregation questions in 2015. Or today. So this is a problem of social pattern maintenance. And if we're talking about young people having real forms of participation, and yet we participate in processes that allow the same problems to persist and allow young people to work on them as if they're in some way changeable, then we have another kind of ethical problem that we want to handle. So that's where I wanted us to begin thinking. Now I'm going to jump into some foundations for the ethical and equitable work I try to do with young people by thinking with a couple of articles, one that's published and one that's in preparation, where I've tried to just grapple with some theoretical questions around these issues. So the first is this question of responsibility and responsiveness. And when you do community-based work with young people, you get faced, as those of you who do this know, with a lot of ethical quandaries and questions and challenges. But I wanted to think first about the notion of responsibility and responsiveness. Responsibility being a kind of timeless thing that we always can look to. It refers to questions of commitment and obligation and how to decide when and how to act or to be silent. And these are really decisions. Even if we're not saying something, we're making a decision not to say that thing. And sometimes that's productive, and sometimes that's really harmful. And then there's the question of responsiveness, which I think of as being imminent or urgent. And it refers to new practices that emerge from collaborative efforts when the research is designed and undertaken in partnership. And where I've experienced the greatest challenge is negotiating the space between timelessness and imminence, sort of these sort of grand principles that I know to be true or right or morally good in some way, and then the specific rubber meeting the road. How do we handle that? So a couple of things that I've tried to do is to think differently about developmental relationships and to think about ethics differently. So while I really value those kind of standard statements of ethics, I'm really interested in the emergent opportunities for ethical development, and I have found that they need to be thought through mutually. So it's not just young people's ethical development, it's our ethical development as well. It's our learning, it's our ability to encounter increasingly challenging situations, and I can't think of a more urgent time in my lifetime for doing this. It's also thinking with context specificity. So historically situated conditions are a thing that we have to attend to no matter what we're designing, and at the same time our environments are dynamic and changes are coming our way faster than we can keep up with them. And so how do we think about that when we're thinking about ethical acts of design? And then finally, for me, I find it really helpful to sort of continuously ask what, where, when, and how is equity available or unavailable here in this circumstance? And we could ask that right now together in this room and think about who's here and who's not here and those kinds of things and who's speaking and who's not speaking. We could think about that in all of our work. I'm going too slowly. I'm going to speed up. With that idea, I then started to move toward work that I haven't published yet, but I've got a draft if anyone wants to kick it around. And I wanted to really think with something that I started with in my graduate work, which was Levin Wanger's situated practice and legitimate peripheral participation, which often gets shorthanded to communities of practice. And the concern that I had with this, doing work with young people, was that I often hear people, students, and practitioners refer to an existing community of practice as if it's a foregone conclusion, like that is a community of practice. And certainly that's a valid approach in certain circumstances, but I think a more productive, sort of energetically powerful approach is to analytically engage the notion of communities of practice. What I mean by that is something along these lines. If we think about legitimate peripheral participation being that lurking position of a newcomer before we move into fuller participation and become old-timers, studies of negotiation of participation in a community provide a fundamental analytical perspective for understanding whether and how youth gain meaningful access to participation. There's a narrow understanding of conditions that promote young people's place at the table in organizing the future of the world into which they are emerging. And a fixation on emerging digital media is one source of the narrowness. So what I've started to argue is as we attend so much to the designs of tools, it's hard to think about where people are practicing and what they're practicing in. And it's actually really hard to see. In fact, we don't even always know what we're in as a community of practice, as it's forming or as we're trying to enter into it. And with that comes the potential of persistent marginalization. And so one point that Lev and Wenger make kind of briefly in the book is that legitimate peripheral participation can also be the persistent marginalization of a group, held permanently on the margin. It's not the one that we think about a lot because the positive version is so attractive to us. It meets a lot of our goals in terms of what we want to accomplish. But this is a real problem, and it's the more likely outcome that we tend to face. So here I argue the temptation to make emerging technologies a central object of analysis can mask relations of power, obscuring newcomers' ability to establish meaningful participation. In particular, young people often experience power and influence as concentrated among adult decision makers. Consequently, youth seeking to move toward fuller participation in a community orient toward establishing a legitimate and influential voice. Let's sit with that for just a second, because that's going to create trouble. Yet, without an understanding of the dynamics of a community, its forms of membership, commitments to stability, and ways of governing new participants, peripheral participants will remain just that, without any necessary sense of transformation and participation. To make those moves, we have to be able to see, to discern where we're headed. We have to understand, am I in a condition that wants my process to become a fuller participant? Or am I in a process that is actually pretending or sort of imagining that I might be that, but really holding me in a marginal position? And if we think about that student advisory board slide I showed earlier, that's certainly a persistent marginal state, right, in terms of being able to act on circumstances. So if you're trying to get some voice in a space, you're going to create disruption. And so I want to talk about young people as productively disruptive, but I don't want to suggest that this just happens. It's an act of mutual engagement. So disruption is just disruption. Like, if my 5-year-old was here right now and kind of like, Mommy, stop doing this, I want your attention, like, that would probably just be disruptive. It wouldn't be productive. And so what I want to talk about is how productive disruption becomes a site for a productive politics of youth participation. And that's a design question for communities. And learners need support, and I mean this not just youth learners, I need all the learners in a mutual engagement to consider that. We need the ability to discern relevant communities of practice and our relative positions within them. So there are a set of methods that I've tried to use over the years since I had wonderful mentors and teachers and guides, and some of them are here. They're coming up, but what I'm looking for are methods that can do these things. I want them to be able to honor difference. And at times disruption. I want them to be able to work with cultural ways of knowing. I want them to remain clear-eyed about power relations. This is a hard one. It's a really hard one, especially when we stand in benevolent positions. And then I want us to recognize and really live our roles in those Belmont principles that we have to read when we're getting ready to do human research, human subjects research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, those are negotiable in terms of our understanding of what the Belmont report says they mean and our understanding of what we say they mean. But those are critical to the actions that we take in our research. And I want methods that help me organize and help us organize for both collective and individual ethical development. So how do we think about the scales of ethical development is where I'm headed. And then recognizing representation is necessary but not sufficient. So representation without engagement with power and power relations is really, really critical, and I've been working on a piece for this, and I think, is Roy here, Roy P? I haven't seen you yet, but he was on the list of participants. But there's a volume coming out, a handbook of culture and learning, which I hope will be really useful to this group, and I've been working on a chapter with Subini about this. And then finally, insisting upon reciprocal and mutual learning and change. So I have looked to iterative design, user-centered design, ethnographic and participant observation, youth participatory action research, and PAR more broadly, social design experiments, university community partnerships and design experimentation, participatory design research, and most recently, ontological design, and thinking about what Escobar describes, drawing on Latin American organizing movements as the possibility for many worlds existing within a world. And so this relational question is really important, but as we scale, it becomes really challenging. And so there are a few sticking points that I think are helpful to cover. These are in no way an exhaustive list of sticking points, just ones that I'm running into as I work through this. One is that notion of losing sight of core structures of power relations, which I've talked about. Another is what I'm calling gaze pressure. I just made that up for this talk. I don't know if I should have cited someone for it. But I'm just talking about the pressure of having our gaze always on groups grappling with marginalization. Always, always, always on people who are already doing a ton of the work and having a really hard time broadening that gaze, returning that gaze, making a reflexive experience of that. I find that to be particularly challenging in part because I really like working with young people, but often I find in my work that the challenges are not really theirs, they're ours. So that's a tricky one for us to deal with as designers. Then I am talking about also sticky dualisms, the sort of persistence of binary thinking. And here I've just given a couple of examples, like the notion of designers and makers being on one side and having sort of the means of production and circulation, and the users, consumers, participants, learners on the other side, sort of consuming and experiencing what someone else presents for them. Even in an iterative process, we often have a lot of our, the powerful roles are sort of on the back end of production, right? You see something up the front, you give some feedback, and then it comes back to you, but you're not engaging in it. And that's a real question. And then finally, for all strategies. So this notion of doing something for all is an important one, I think. Because on one hand, it's better than some just can't do it. My mom was just telling me a story the other day about an experience she had where, she was working with a person at her school when she was a guidance counselor, and he looked at a student's grades and went, oh, I see, like she's just an average student. She just can't really do math. And this was a while ago, but you could imagine that conversation could happen today. So that is a problem. I like the notion of everyone can do math, right? For all is good in that sense. But the challenge is that it also becomes an easy place to lose sight of historic power relations and sort of default into neutrality and not make those moves that are necessary to actually deal with justice and to deal with equity. And so what I'm really heading toward with this talk is a way to think differently about scale. I have a tendency when I think about the National Science Foundation in particular to imagine that things are always trying to be scaled, and that comes from just my training and my work on projects. How do we take the best ideas and just scale them? And I've grappled with that because I focus on work that's so relational. How do you scale relationships? And that's a real challenge and also a necessary question. So I want to pose some ways of thinking about that. I'm going to tell a tiny personal story. I might get some of the details wrong, but you'll get the idea. I started in this field as a single young person, and now I'm a 45-year-old mother of two and a wife and a learner and I don't know, all these things. And so I have a now 6-year-old, but the conversation I'm going to tell you about was when she was 5. We had agreed to go somewhere. I don't know what it was. We had time pressure. We needed to leave. And she had decided she wanted to play with her dolls and had gotten this great idea and was really excited and was like, I'm going to do this thing. And I said, that's great. What a wonderful idea. But we've got to go, so do it when we come back. And she just flipped out, like just went berserk. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? Now, my first reaction, and I've certainly done this as a parent, is to use my size and my power and my access to resources and my authority to just say no. If I need to, I'll just pick you up and carry you to the car and off we go. For some reason, there's a part of me, a little part of me, that's like the little part of me that does this work that says, you're violating your own principles here. So I paused and I looked and I said, what is happening? Just a minute, what is happening? Why is she freaking out? I didn't even say no. I just said, we'll do it when we come back. Come on. Cut me some slack, kid. So something, I don't know where this came from, just made me say to her, I get the sense that you feel like you have this voice inside of you, and it gave you this beautiful idea. And then I came in and I said, forget your voice. Your voice isn't important. Mine's important. Is that what happened? And her eyes got big, and she nodded. Yeah, that's what's going on. I went, oh, okay. That voice is really important, and you should trust it. And I want to help you learn to trust it because it's going to be your guide in the world. I thought it was a great idea. I'm sorry that I made you think otherwise. Do you still want to go with me because we need to go? And would you be willing to do this later? She said, yes, yeah, yes, I want to go. Okay, yeah, we can do this later. We're good. And whew, off we went. Wow. Okay, so this is a person-to-person relationship. It's possible because I've known her since she was in the womb, and we've been working this out for a long time, and it doesn't always go this well. Number two, if you start to think about scale, imagine now we're teachers in classrooms, and we have kids having these meltdowns throughout the day, and we take the time to do that with each one of them. You could imagine that that might cause you not to get through all the things you're trying to get through. So there's some real challenges here. So I'm not suggesting that every kind of relationality can scale, but the impetus can scale. So I'm going to give a couple of examples now from my work. I'm going to go a little faster. I do this project called Democracy Lab, and it's kind of perpetually in pilot mode in my point of view. But the cool thing about it right now is that when I moved to San Diego and started to work there, I inherited a project, a partnership actually. And inheriting an old partnership is tricky because the relationships are at first relying on someone else's relationships, and you have to build them fresh. But essentially what we do is we have a practicum course. It's called New Media and wait, we changed the name. I think it's called New Media and Community Life. So we bring a group of undergrads down every single quarter, 10 weeks, fall, winter, spring, to this about 20 miles from campus to a subsidized apartment complex in Southeast San Diego. And it's essentially a learning center that is a hub inside of the apartment complex. And the woman on the back left, Beverly Anderson, is our partner. And there are some folks here that I won't sort of go into description, but I would note all of the forms of technology from magic wand to computer in this photo. They all have their place. So Democracy Lab works to expose opportunities for experiential democracy in daily life. It focuses on experiences with tools and practices for imagining, building, and repairing our shared life together. And we have specifically focused as a tool on storytelling for a couple of specific reasons. The first is that it's accessible across generations. Our little kids who aren't even quite verbal, all the way to our elders, can participate in storytelling of various forms. So it's an accessible tool. There aren't that many tools like that. That can get the 2-year-olds and the 80-year-olds together. The second is that if we study the way stories are edited, changed, and circulated, we actually can start to see power relations. We can discern what the relations are in the community, who has authority and influence and who doesn't. That's really important for all of us if we're going to do those things that I talked about earlier. So it becomes a really useful tool for us. And also we're in a communication department. We have a bunch of students who are really interested in media production. So it's a perfect kind of joining up for us. And so we work in critical and reflexive takes on production and notions of co-production, and we try to address mutual development for all of us. A couple of things, I'm just going to click through some photos to give you a feel. A couple of things that happen that let me think about relational work at different scales is that we have to build relationships with one another. We have undergraduates coming in for usually just 10 weeks at a time, and then we have people like myself and my colleague, Dr. Camille Campion, who've been having this relationship, for me, it's been 6 years. For her, it's been over a decade. And so these relationships exist across the community center and across the campus, and so they get us into institutional levels of conversation and right down into nitty-gritty. And a couple of examples that I want to sort of point to are in dealing with these kinds of ethical questions. We started to notice that in production, it's easy to get the kids in front of the camera and to get the undergrads behind the camera. It's easy for the undergrads to continue to hold all the knowledge and carry it with them back to campus and to their dorm rooms about post-production and about the decisions that actually shape the political message and the kinds of communication that come out. And it's easy for the kids to be the representational face of that process. So how do we deal with that? How do we get that more open that sort of hidden box of those kinds of decisions and practices and skills inside of the community is a thing that we're asking a lot. And how do we do it in relation to tools people actually have on hand, whether we're present or not? So that if we're not there, these activities, if people are interested, can continue. And so that's sort of one level of local scale of relation. At the same time, there's this other thing that's happening, which is that this is a subsidized housing complex, which means it has owners who don't live there, which means it has funding from Housing and Urban Development at the federal level, which means it has people who have to qualify to live there and they have to show paperwork that their income is just in that sweet spot of enough to be subsidized and not too much to get kicked out. That's a very, very narrow space to live within, and it creates a lot of precarity. And while we've been working on this project, a lot of issues have come up with that. And so I won't go into great detail, but what I'll say is what we've learned is that being there and having the relational presence means that the people like me and Dr. Campion can be invited into those experiences with people as people who can support and work on things that I think Democracy Lab should be about. At the same time, let me go back. At the same time, the undergrads who are only there 10 weeks at a time are not really invited into that, right? People, would you feel comfortable inviting someone who's there for 10 weeks for a class into the sort of deep challenges of health or housing precarity, et cetera? So these are things that are all part of the project, and then we have to think our designs through those kinds of scales to try to understand where do we find a practical place to do democratic work. So not the big scale institutional and governance level, and not the philosophical level, but the day-to-day practice inside of environments that are typically actually structured in a more authoritative, authoritarian way. How do we get into that? Given that, there are also competing narratives. So this point about storytelling is one of the things that I wanted to hint at. We do all kinds of projects as a group, and we don't really worry about who did what and for what purposes. But storytelling is a thing that gets leveraged. So this is an example of the nonprofit that runs the Learning Center. So the nonprofit is independent, and has to be, of the owners and the developers, and also the apartment managers. And as a result, we have the university telling stories, and the university means me. I tell my version of stories, but it also means sometimes I catch, missives from the chancellor, right? That little sort of like, here's what's going on, what the university is up to. Or I catch other kinds of packaging of what we do for other kinds of purposes. So those are circulation and power questions. This was an example where we got an email about a project that Dr. Campion had actually developed and organized. And there's no mention of UCSD or Dr. Campion whatsoever here, because this is sort of from the standpoint of what they're doing at the nonprofit. They're saying, hey, look at this great thing that we're doing, which of course is wonderful. Like, we sent this around, we're like, yes, this is cool. But it's also an example of what parts of the story get told and what parts don't get told, and for whose purposes. So in this process, I mentioned the housing precarity. The students got moved. And the Learning Center got moved, and everyone in the apartment complex got moved. And I want to raise this as an equity point, because from the standpoint of the developers, this was a circumstance where the stories of people, the murals on the walls that they created over years, the relationships that are sustained even when people move out and come back were not central. The relationships with neighbors were not even central. They were like, you should be grateful, we're going to renovate. You're gonna have to move, and it's too expensive for us to move you back, so you're gonna have new neighbors, a whole new ecology to deal with. And when the residents were upset, they felt affronted by that, right? This is a problem of storytelling and communication and relationship that is having a big problem at scale. And these are happening to people, these situations, all the time. And so how do we enter into that with our tools and technologies and design is the question that I'm asking. The new Learning Center is beautiful, right? At a certain level, when we finally moved in, it's lovely. At the same time, it's rather sterile compared to those earlier pictures. It's not lived in and homey, it's very echoey. If you notice up here, the walls don't go all the way to the ceiling, and they now share the space with the managers. And that means that's a place people kind of try to avoid sometimes, especially if they're worried about paying rent on time. So it creates a totally different set of practices that we're trying to deal with and challenges. And yet, we're still the Learning Center. It's still the people. It's still the relations. So I just want to kind of bring these as examples of thinking through these relational forms of work and how they don't perfectly scale. But I'm looking for a theory, a way to work that helps us think through that. And I want to point, I'm going to go like 3 minutes over, probably, and I apologize, but I think I can do it. Okay, so this is a thing that I'm trying to theorize with now, and I'm calling it a nodal design. So I have the privilege of working on another NSF project as a co-PI with my lovely colleague Victor Mintzes in the Department of Cognitive Science at UCSD, and he's designed these workshops that he takes into science classes, and one of them is called the Sound Circus. And in the Sound Circus, he begins with a pipe. He goes up to the front of the room, he holds the pipe, he strikes it. I'm just gonna borrow this. right? He does that. And then he walks over to the students and he hands them a pipe. You'll see this young woman is holding a pipe and she's looking like, what? She holds the pipe and he doesn't say a word. He just hands them the pipe and then they do this. And everyone laughs. And then they hand it to someone else and they do this. And they don't get this lovely, right? So what's happening is that there are nodes where you have the minimal amplitude in the vibration of the pipe. It allows the most fluid, I'm not a physicist, so if I got that wrong, sorry. It allows the most fluid movement of the wave, and that's how you get that nice resonance. It's what you get with guitars and violins and xylophones and all these lovely instruments. And it blew my mind because I thought, this is the design principle. This is the design theory. How do we design things that have form and shape, right? Something new, a guitar is for something specific, right? We made something, but what you can do with it is so broad. So many different forms of expression can come out of that. And so I think that this sort of theorizing with nodal design that I'm trying to do offers form and creates a space for emerging practice. Yet it strives for the lightest touch, the least limit possible on the flow of our lives, hearts, and minds. And it reckons with historic power relations and hegemonic habits. And finally, it sustains and adapts and is responsive and responsible. That's the theorizing work that I think helps us think through these scales of design and relational work. I'll close with this. Totally like the pinnacle of my life, professional and otherwise. 2 weeks ago, before classes started, my colleague Wayne Yang and I, Wayne is amazing, he's an ethnic studies professor and the provost of Muir College at UCSD, who started talking with me last year about this broader project called Black Like Water, and one of the things we imagined was the possibility of a Black Surf Week. We collaborated with the Black Resource Center, Outdoor Recreation, and worked to launch a place-based approach to Black student recruitment and retention at UC San Diego, with the main premise being to create a set of place-based practices with Black students with water as both metaphor and material to do Black placemaking. And the activities include surfing, summer research, training experiences, professional networking, Black and Indigenous relationship building, and it's a design-based process. And anyone who is interested in these questions of the diasporas and Indigenous relationships with land and water was welcome. And the thing that blew my mind was that in just a day, the divisions of the university broke down. We had staff, we had faculty, we had grads, we had undergrads, we had family, we had friends. Everybody was welcome. We had surfers, we had the rec people, we had photographers. People are bringing their whole selves suddenly to this whole process. And one of our provosts, one of our deans of student life is a photographer. Iman Agrama Meinert took these photos. These are students who participated. We did a photo shoot. And I just want you to imagine that this is something, even when you go to UCSD, that does not happen. I have wanted to surf. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And I got the job at UCSD, and I was like, I'm going to learn to surf. And then I got there and thought, okay, maybe I should get tenure first. I got tenure. I was like, and then I'm going to take sabbatical, and I'm going to learn to surf while I'm on sabbatical. And I didn't do it. I just didn't do it. There's something intimidating about the culture and the space. It's not a hard touch thing, but it's a thing where you know you don't belong out there somehow. And then all of a sudden, we belonged, and we surfed, and we learned, and we were taught, and we were together, and people who were part of the university and people who were part of the community came out to join us, and I think it's a brilliant example of nodal design at scale. The surfboard itself moves flowingly across the water, but you have to learn how to practice and have your own style with it. The culture of surfing is its own thing. So I'll close with this quote I discovered during this process, a really great 15-minute documentary, it's linked here, called Surf Girls Jamaica. Imani Womack comes from a surfing family in Jamaica and developed an amazing program. And she has these two quotes. That's not Imani, that's one of the students who participated in the picture. But I want to share these with you. The first is, surfing can be that one split second where that is your pause, where you're like, okay, how am I going to approach my day? How am I going to improve my own life? How am I going to make things better for myself and for everybody around me? It gives you that moment. If anyone surfs, you know that this is like a real and deeply felt experience of surfing. And then she gives this quote from her father that I think is quite important. I always heard my dad, he's a surfer, a famous surfer and shaper. I always heard my dad, he would say, surfing is one of the most positive sports because it takes your eyes from all of the negativity and the corruption that is in society, and it turns you to the horizon. So it's like a more positive experience. You're looking at endless possibilities for yourself because you're just staring off into the horizon. So I think this is the kind of relational work that we're doing. Equity lives in our relationships with one another, with land, with water, and with the living world, within our systems for living, within our facility for repair, and within our possible futures. And working for equity requires an ability to think and design flexibly across scales, more so than scaling up. Anticipating and taking responsibility for the likelihood we will reproduce systemic patterns, clear-eyed and sustained attention to power relations across scales, and courageously standing for the right to be different and to belong, which I borrowed from Ronaldo Rosaldo. So it's a lot, it's a tall order, but it could lead to more things like surfing. So I hope that you'll give these things a try, and I look forward to talking. Thanks for giving me a few extra minutes, and thanks for the opportunity.